Hi, just a quick introduction to this film. I always say in my films that drop a comment in, ask me any questions, kind of that sort of thing. And Jeff Stevenson, hi Jeff, has done just that. In a previous film, I mentioned and talked about making panoramas, and I went through the process, kind of being outdoors and making the panorama. But he asked about this process of stitching the images together. So I've made a quick film of how to do that, and I've used two options: the Photoshop option and the Lightroom option, and done a compare and contrast. So kind of hopefully that it will explain the process for you, Jeff, and anyone else who's watching. Just one thing before I get into the computer and show you, there is no perfect solution. So some people will use slightly different technique. This is a technique I use and find works for me. So hope you enjoy it and find it informative.
Well, here I am in Photoshop, and this is actually the slightly more complicated process, but it can be the process from end to end. So you start with your images, and you can end up with the kind of final image that you're ready to publish or do whatever it is that you're going to do with it. Whereas in Lightroom, it tends to um, blend the images together into a panorama, but then you've got more work to do. But anyway, I'll show you Lightroom later. This is the Photoshop version. So what you need to do is go up to File, obviously in the top left-hand corner, come down to Automate, and then down the bottom option is Photo Merge. Um, Select your files. So I've got my files saved. So I've got these 7 images from Whistling Sands. And remember, in the previous film, I talked about photographing in portrait or vertical mode to help you create your panoramas. And I think it's important to do that. And you'll see the benefit and the reason why in a second. So just collect those images, click OK, and then you'll see they come up here on uh, this uh, this pop-up. Now on the left, there's a few options that are important to think about. So this is how Photoshop merges and blends the images together. So auto actually is probably the one I use 95% of the time, but there are a couple of different options to look at. Perspective, what perspective does is it selects what it thinks is the center image and then blends the other images. So in this case, it'll select probably this image in the middle and then 3 images on either side and tries to automatically uh, do it that way. It works quite well, particularly if there's a strong central focus, like maybe a castle or a church or a building. So if you're taking a panorama where the middle image is something important, you might want to select perspective. I very rarely use cylindrical. Um, it's probably I think the times I've used it works similarly to perspective, but it works better if you've got a really wide panorama. Um, uh, so lots and lots of images, and it kind of avoids that bowing in the middle that you sometimes get. Spherical, I don't think I've ever used. That's essentially if you're doing a 360 degree, so not just a linear image, but if you're going up, down, left, right, and sideways. So kind of that's for 360 degree. Collage is where you've taken lots of different images um, um, in lots of different positions, and it kind of think of it almost as a when you put images on a board. If you print images out and then a bit like a jigsaw, you try and stick them together to make a collage. You probably did it in school where you can stick things to make a collage. Uh, and reposition it's similar to auto, but it doesn't transform it in any way. So it just literally kind of plonks them together. So I never use that. Down below, you obviously have the option to blend images together, which you want to select. Vignette removal will take away any of that darkening that you sometimes get in the corner. Geometric distortion correction tries to deal with some of the issues of uh, kind of the distortion you sometimes get in your lens, but also the distortion that you'll get as you move the camera. And then content aware fill, transparent areas. I'll show you that in a minute. I'll click that and I'll show you what that happens. So you then just click OK and you wait for it to process. Now, depending on whether your computer is gas powered or nuclear powered, it will take either seconds or minutes, but you can see it building on the side, and then you just have to wait for that process to work its way through. So there you go. That is what Photoshop has created as my panorama. That was the 7 images stitched together, and you can see it's quite a kind of a lot of space. This is when I mentioned taking images in portrait mode for panoramas. You end up with a lot of space to work with, and I'll show you in a second why that's important. But also I mentioned the content awareness fill. If you look down in the bottom corners and the top corners, um, if I hadn't clicked that, those spaces would be white. But Photoshop has done a actually pretty good job of just filling those details in. Now I only selected that so you could see what happens, because actually I don't need those corners filled in at all. But if you're doing your panorama, you might need those corners filled in, and Photoshop does quite a good job of matching kind of what should be in those areas to what is next to it. Pretty good. So next stage is to look at all your layers down here. That's obviously the kind of 7 images plus this final creation. So I'll just shift and click all of those images. Then I'll go over to layer and just scroll down to smart objects and convert to a smart object. And essentially what that does, it flattens all of those layers on the side into one image that is still editable. So rather than dealing with all those layers now, I've just got one. You can see they've all disappeared. They've all merged down into kind of the one layer, but it's all able for me to edit. Now, what you will notice is that there's a bit of a distortion. If I, for example, if I bring a guide down from the top of the image, you'll see if you look towards the horizon where the sea is, there is a bend. Now, don't want to get into an argument about flat Earth because there is a bend obviously on the globe, but you wouldn't be able to see that bend on the horizon. So that should be flat. And also, if you look across here to the headland, it's curving upwards, and that's because of the distortion of the lens and also the movement of the camera. So that needs to be straightened out, but I'll just move that line out of the way. First thing I'll do is do a bit of cropping. So I like my panoramas to have a 3:1 ratio. Just my personal choice. You can do whatever you like with yours, but I like the 3:1 ratio. So I'm going to position it about there, just to approve that. And then you'll see that kind of the bend in the image makes it look a little bit unrealistic. So we need to deal with that. So I'll just come over to edit, I choose transform, and then warp, which is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th option down, and then you get your grid up. And what warp allows you to do is essentially just pull and stretch the image. So I need to deal with this bend in the horizon over here. So I'm just going to click and pull down a little bit. It looks straightish, but what I'll do is I'll drag a grid line down, give me a bit of a guide. So I'll just place that below the horizon. So it's giving me a guide that I can work to. Now I'll do this relatively quickly, but obviously if I was preparing this, sorry, for publishing, then I'd spend a bit more time. And then obviously I've straightened that out a bit, but as you can see, the headland curves significantly. So just coming to the edge of the image there and kind of dealing with that. So as you can see, you can make all sorts of weird movements with warp, but I'm just trying to lift that a bit. It's not perfect. I'd take more time kind of with that if I was doing, but they see I've created the panorama. It's relatively straight. Needs that horizon's not perfectly straight, but just for the purpose of showing you how to do that. And that's essentially the panorama created. Now, what I prefer to do is uh, save this and export to Lightroom and then do my editing in Lightroom. Um, but that's essentially how you would create your panorama in Photoshop. So what I'll do now is switch over to Lightroom and show you how I'll do the same process in Lightroom. So here we are in Lightroom, same 7 images selected. I'll just come up here. You must select all 7 images. You can see they're highlighted. Come up here to photo. It's about the 5th option down on photo merge. You have HDR, HDR panorama, but I want the middle one, which is panorama. Just click that and Lightroom will do its magic. So there you go. Lightroom has kind of merged the images, and actually you get a better preview in the Lightroom module because it shows you the image. And remember the content awareness fill in Photoshop. Well, you can see these are the corners. That's what it would have looked like without the content awareness fill. Um, but obviously in Photoshop it filled those in automatically. You also get a better option here with the choices. Now, weirdly, I don't know why. The options seem to be the other way around. So spherical is the top option in Lightroom, whereas auto and then perspective are the top option. So it just seems to be the other way around. Also, weirdly, spherical seems to work differently in Lightroom than it does in Photoshop. So I often use spherical in Lightroom and very, very rarely, if ever, use it in Photoshop. Don't ask me why, not sure. But it has a nice option of showing what the different choices do. So that is the image as rendered by spherical. I'll click cylindrical, and there you see you kind of get an image that is a bit narrower than in spherical. And then I'll choose perspective just to show you what the differences are. Now there you see, now spherical does an absolute terrible job there. Um, Sorry, perspective does a terrible job there. Um, it's tried to, I think, select the center image and then obviously creates this, I don't know, a huge distortion. So perspective doesn't work very often for me in Lightroom. So I'll go back to spherical. And then you've got some options down here. Boundary warp. If you choose boundary warp, it just deals with kind of those images, those issues in the corner. So it just stretches it out. Change that back. Boundary warp does sometimes bend the horizon even more. Fill the edges is the same choice as content awareness fill. I don't think Lightroom does quite as good a job as Photoshop does. So it's done the same thing as Photoshop, but I always find that they come out a bit too dark in Lightroom, so you end up with a kind of vignette effect. So I don't often choose fill the edges, so I'll unselect that. I also kind of one of the reasons I don't often use fill the edges or in Photoshop content awareness fill is I tend to crop all of that out anyway, so it's an unnecessary process. Auto crop I don't use because obviously you're then allowing Lightroom to choose how it crops. Auto settings, it kind of does a bit of adjustments to the image, which I don't want, and I don't want to create a stack either. I want to create a single image. So I click merge and let Lightroom do its thing. So Lightroom's done its thinking and it's created the next to, you see the 7 images, and just next to it, it's created the merged image. So I'll just select that. And you see, it's quite a good job. Need to do the cropping. So I would crop and do obviously my processing in Lightroom now. And here's one I made earlier. That's the final. That's the final image. Um, so obviously I've done editing. I've straightened the horizon, done some color correction, but that's the final image. I tend to use Lightroom for 80% of my panoramas. It does quite a good job. But Photoshop, you get more control and there are more tools available at your disposal. But hopefully that gives you an idea of the two options. Any questions, let me know, and feedback's always welcome. And don't forget to click the thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks very much. Bye.